Dr. King believed in true equality.
In the era of white supremacy and white nationalism, Dr. King's message is even more important.
It's frightening, the contrast in how Black peaceful protesters are treated in contrast to mob insurrectionists.
Systemic racism. Racism is in the DNA of this country. We've come a long way. We've got a long way to go.
And this celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday today, like no other. His message weighted down by our national agony as we grapple with the second impeachment trial, a deadly Capitol siege, and the inauguration of a new president in the shadow of National Guard troops. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica Aguirre. Marcus Washington will be joining us a little later for our 9th episode in our ongoing series, Race in America, The Conversation. So what would Dr. King have made of this moment in history? Have we as a nation failed? Or would he look at the victory, some big and many small, and still dare to dream?
Content of that character. I have a dream.
We are living in unsettling times where dreams of equality feel hard to believe in. But when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his famous speech at the March on Washington in 1963, it was also a time of political and racial discord in this country.
Where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
As we honor Dr. King and his legacy today, we also remember that dreams are often born in darkness. On the day before the unprecedented storming of the U.S. Capitol by pro-Trump supporters, Georgia voters elected Reverend Raphael Warnock, a Democrat, and the first black senator in the state's history.
May my story be an inspiration to some young person.
Warnock served as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the same congregation Dr. King presided over until his assassination. The Georgia election once again shined a light on another crusader, Stacey Abrams, credited with organizing the large turnout of black voters at the Georgia polls. But among those steps forward came what some saw as painful stumbles. Prosecutors in Ohio declined to file federal charges against the white officers who fatally shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice. In Wisconsin, the DA's office announced it would not file charges against the Kenosha police officers who shot Jacob Blake in the back 7 times.
There's no justification what was done to my son.
And here at home, Alameda County's DA says she could not file further charges against an officer accused in the killing of Oscar Grant.
My heart hurts on today.
From declining to prosecute to defiling in Oakland, where someone vandalized, then stole a bust of Breonna Taylor.
And no matter what they do, we can rebuild it.
But as we celebrate Dr. King and his vision for America with songs and footsteps, we are reminded that while dreams may come in the dark of night, they live on with those who carry them into the daylight. Into the days ahead and straight into the ballot box. Turnout among black voters this past November, historic. Led by black-led grassroots organizations like Black Voters Matter. Volunteers went door to door, rode buses, and did everything they could to get people registered to vote. Joining me now from Atlanta, Georgia is LaTosha Brown. She's co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Thank you so much for being with us. So, LaTosha, you did the very work that Dr. King talked about. He said that voting is the foundation stone for political action, and more than 1 million African Americans cast ballots in Georgia because of the work that you did.
Absolutely. You know, I am a native of Selma, Alabama. And growing up in Selma, Alabama, being a child, a daughter of the civil rights movement, I was surrounded by people who were part of that movement, that voting rights movement in Selma, including an elder aunt that I have. And so part of what I think is really important is that we really recognize that the work still continues, that we are part of a greater legacy until every single person in this country, every citizen has free and fair access to the ballot. We have work to do. Even in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, it would pass as a compromise. It was never the fullness of the vision. And so I think those of us who literally have inherited the benefits of those before us, that we literally have to be that much more committed to voting rights and restoring voting rights in this country.
So it has really been a painful year of racial reckoning in this country. But do you think that that historic turnout would even have been possible if it wasn't for those Black Lives Matters protests that we saw, and also with the impact of COVID in communities of color?
You know, it is without question that what we saw in this country this summer, when we saw the Black Lives Matter movement all across this country, in all 50 states, there were uprisings. It ignited something in me. It ignited in millions of people for us to have to face the truth that in this country, we have not seen the government, we've not seen police, law enforcement really operate in a way that says that Black lives matter, but absolutely the opposite. And so there's a generation of young organizers, there's a generation of new people who normally have seen, well, politics, that's something that I don't really get involved in, that have been activated and really been called into this movement. And so I certainly think that what we saw all around this country, what we saw in Georgia, that Black Lives Matter, literally that energy, that synergy, that vision, that we can all have a nation and create a nation that is really that we stamp out anti-Black racism, it certainly played a role in what I think in the victories that we've seen in recent months.
Oh, we certainly saw that in Georgia, especially when we saw the state's first Black Democrat elected to the U.S. Senate. That shift happened in Georgia because of everything else that we've seen.
Absolutely. You know, anytime, I always say that anytime that we put a crack, you know, in the glass ceiling, it lets more light in. And so part of what Black Lives Matter movement did was it centered that we are in a multiracial, multi-generational movement, that we want something different. We believe that we deserve something different. And it certainly has led to some different outcomes.
Was that difficult for you to see that short-lived victory of what happened in Georgia and then the very next day to see those Capitol riots? That must have been jarring. And can we have unity now without accountability?
Now, it was deeply disappointing, but, you know, I grew up in the Deep South. I am a daughter of the Black Belt in Alabama. Anytime there has been Black progress in this country, we've seen white backlash. That has been, I can go back to Reconstruction in Mississippi, where there were 300, right after slavery, the first election in which African-American voters elected 300 Black people into public office. There were white mobs that went around the state and murdered 70 of those 300 in a course of days. There's always been a backlash. And so, you know, until we stamp out, until we do what Dr. King says of three evils, which is dealing with militarism and violence, dealing with poverty and eliminating poverty, and dealing with structural racism, uprooting that, we will continue to see these cycles. And so while it is deeply disappointing, right, to actually be able to witness what we're witnessing right now, the fact of the matter, until we deal with structural racism and eliminating anti-Black racism, we will continue to deal with these cycles, oftentimes that are laced with violence.
Well, we're certainly at an inflection point in this country, but are you optimistic?
Oh, absolutely. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. You know, I come from a people, I stand here, I come from a people who were enslaved, who were treated like they were less than dogs, that literally not only did not have the right to vote, they did not even have the right to actually have agency over their bodies, but yet here I stand. And that's because people literally stepped into a space of having faith and having hope and deciding that they were going to use their agency to create something different. So what gives me hope is the people in this country. I do believe that when we work together, when we decide that racism will no longer exist, it will be eliminated. When we decide that we will have a government that literally serves people, and we have businesses that are held accountable, not because of profit, but the interests of people, then things will change. So I am very optimistic because I believe in the power of the faith, and I have hope in people of this country.
LaTosha Brown, Dr. King would be proud, for sure. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it is the burning question. Would the police response have looked different had rioters descended on the Capitol have been Black or brown? The former chief of Capitol Police said requests for the National Guard were denied or delayed 6 times. Now, some say that's in stark contrast to what we saw last summer during Black Lives Matter protests and during the death of George Floyd, when the streets were lined with police officers. Okay, tonight we're going to hear from someone who lives in D.C. and who took part in those peaceful protests over the summer. Dr. Jamie Riley is an educator with Bay Area Ties, an assistant dean of students at UC Berkeley for 4 years. He taught diversity and inclusion courses. Marcus Washington spoke to Riley about to America's and what it's like in the nation's capital now, just 2 days before inauguration.
Folks are a little nervous, but I think our values as a city and a community are still very much strong in what we believe, which is against what the folks are coming here to protest for.
What went through your mind as you saw a crowd of people storm the U.S. Capitol, breaking windows, climbing walls? What was going through your mind?
That what we saw was, in the work that I do, doing diversity and inclusion, there's this idea of privilege and this idea of, the term that we use of white supremacy, that there's this idea that folks that are white have different access, different opportunities, different privileges than folks of color. And we saw that come full force.
I don't know any person that I know who's Black that didn't say, now, if that had been all Black people.
Absolutely.
It's like you can't help but say, what is the big difference? And It's the color of their skin.
I've never seen the ability of folks who claim to be using their voice for good and for change to be treated with such kindness, so gently, and to be such a delayed reaction. You wouldn't imagine some of the barricades and some of the experiences this summer for folks who are just coming out with banners and with signs and who are marching in the streets. The reality of it is the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly we can say the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and then George Floyd, on the backs of the killings of, if we go back years, Emmett Till, on the backs of Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland, Black folks out here this summer were once again trying to use our voice to demand a country that saw and that cared and that recognized us as humans, basic human rights.
When you were faced with attacks from police during the protest, talk to me about what that feels like.
I mean, I know you can probably share this. It's the same feeling I get when I'm driving probably a little over the speed limit or at the speed limit and a police officer pulls behind me. I assume in that minute that I could, my life is at stake.
See them? What's your name? Officer.
Marcus, I'll be 100% honest with you. When I went out this summer, I knew it was very likely that I would be harmed or that I would experience violence. It was scary. I'm not gonna lie. Being pepper sprayed while trying to fight against the murder of people who look like me, who could be my uncles, my fathers, my cousins, me, and being violently attacked for that just solidified that this country has a lot of work to do. But I'm willing to go through it. It won't be the last time I'm out there. The cry for equality for Black folks and folks of color is a peaceful request. But to, unfortunately, people in power, it is a tumultuous request, because what it really means is them sharing and giving up some of their power.
A day that we are honoring Dr. King for all that he's done on his birthday, but celebrating the fight that he gave for so many people.
And so Dr. King has given us a framework and I think a mechanism for us to be able to do that. And at least annually, if not, I know I do it daily, but annually it gives us an opportunity to stop and reflect and really ask ourselves, how committed are we individually to this fight? How committed are we individually to ensure that the generations that come after us live a more equitable and inclusive society?
Okay, equitable. That is the key word here. And while so much has changed this past year, Dr. King's goal of an equitable and inclusive society really, sadly, has a long way to go. I want to show you some disparities when it comes to income. According to the Silicon Valley Pain Index, the average white worker in the Bay Area earns $83,000 a year, but the average Black worker earns $41,000. Simple math, folks, shows us that that's half the amount. Well, too ambitious, the kind of shade cast on women, including her aunt, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Up next, meet the very ambitious and proud of it, Meena Harris, who's teaching little girls everywhere to own their ambition.
Good evening, I'm Chris Kimura. We invite you to join the conversation tonight online. Please share your thoughts on our Facebook page or our Twitter feed. Just search NBC Bay Area, look up Jessica or me. I'll be back in a little bit to share some of what people are sharing. Race in America. We'll be right back.